You're listening to episode 204 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Buddhist and teacher of mindfulness-based stress reduction teachers, Bob Stahl, joins us to speak about the alignment between Buddhism and contemporary mindfulness. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhist. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes, in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes search for mindfulness and look for the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. There is a lot of talk these days between traditional Buddhism and the mindfulness movement. I say talk because much of it is just that. Talk. There's very little dialogue going on, and almost no friendly, let alone compassionate, exploration of what is meant by mindfulness, before all mindfulness gets dismissed with a wave of the term McMindfulness. I admit quite openly I have shared the concerns and the misperceptions about programs like MBSR, and realized my misgivings were due to my own innocent ignorance. So, I've done what any good Buddhist would do when honestly facing their own ignorance. I explored, I tried it out, I learned, and I practiced, and found something of value in what is being done even outside the clinical setting. Of course, there may still be poorly trained teachers or programs, but that is so with anything. It is only by open understanding and engagement that we can hope to ensure the positive, intentional action bears fruit. Bob Stahl, PhD, has founded 7 mindfulness-based stress reduction programs in the medical centers throughout the San Francisco Bay Area, and currently directs programs at Dominican Hospital in Santa Cruz, El Camino Hospital in Mountain View, and Los Gatos. Bob serves as a senior teacher for the Oasis Institute for Mindfulness-Based Professional Education and Training. He is a co-author of A Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Workbook, Living with Your Heart Wide Open, Calming the Rush of Panic, and A Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Workbook for Anxiety. Bob is a long-term practitioner of mindfulness meditation, having lived and practiced over 8 years in a Buddhist monastery, and is the guiding teacher at Insight Santa Cruz and a visiting teacher at Spirit Rock and Insight Meditation Society. Note that Bob guides us in a mindfulness exercise in today's episode, and part of that is an intentional period of silence for practice. So sit back, relax, and have a nice kocha. And our guest today is Bob Stahl. Bob, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks for inviting me.
So nice to see you again. And we are here to talk about Buddhism's alignment with mindfulness. And you're in a rather unique position. as a Buddhist and also a teacher of teachers in mindfulness-based stress reduction programs. You've been doing this for a long time, but before we get into that, I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about your background, how you first encountered Buddhism and contemplative practice.
Thank you, Ted. When I was 4 years old, I had my first realization that that life was not going to last forever. When I was in the back seat of my parents' car, we were riding to see my grandmother, and I had this realization that we're all going to die. It could happen at any time. And when I shared this with my parents, my mother and father very lovingly said to me, "Don't worry, Bobby. It won't happen for a long, 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 long time." And I knew that they were actually, I can remember knowing they were trying to be nice to me and to comfort me, but I knew that it wasn't fully the truth, because what I understood was death could come at any moment. And by the time I was 10, I actually lost three significant people in my life. My younger brother, Buddy, who died of an illness, Tay-Sachs disease. I shared a room with him. My best friend, who lived across the street, Ellen Chabot, went into a diabetic coma one night. And then my grandfather, who lived downstairs. And so growing up, I was filled with a lot of grief and despair. And what is this life? This was also the time of the Vietnam War. And fortunately, the war persisted in high school. Actually, my high school closed because of a strike against the war. And I was very, very confused. Fortunately, I had a very high draft number. I eventually went to college and majored in skiing, getting high and drunk, and trying to meet girls. And wasn't so successful at all of those things, but at the end of my second year, I flunked out. So I was readmitted back on a warning, and my mother pleaded with me, "Isn't there something that would appeal to you in the courses?" I looked at the catalog, and nothing really appealed to me. I didn't want to do any more reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, but something jumped out, and it was called The Wisdom of the East. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Zen. I knew nothing about this, but I knew one thing, and that was that growing up, I loved to go to Chinese restaurants and eat Chinese food. And I loved the artwork on the walls, and even the waiters and the waitresses had a different vibe than Howard Johnson's. And so I was intrigued. There was something mystical about the East that I was intrigued. And I said, why not? And so I went to this class. The first day, I'll never forget, my professor, as I walked in, was sitting on top of his desk in a full lotus position. I'd never had a professor like this before. This was the early 70s in northern Vermont. And as he began to talk, I realized that he talked in a way that I had never had a professor talk like before. He was embodied. I didn't know that word at the time, but I recognized in time that this guy knew something, and whatever he knew, I wanted to know what he knew. And he assigned to us to read the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, the book of the way of life, Taoism. And I fell in love with the Tao. Often those words from Lao Tzu were just so resonant with my deep inner being. I came across epigram number 47, which says that there's no need to look outside your window, for everything you need to know is inside of you. And this was a very striking and powerful poem that spoke to me. And I realized, as time went on, how much that I had journeyed away from myself, lived with so much confusion, despair, and grief, and that if I really wanted to know something, I needed to begin to look within. And that really began my spiritual journey when I began to meditate in the early 70s. And then eventually I went on to graduate school in California, the Institute of Asian Studies, now known as the California Institute of Integral Studies, and was studying Hinduism and Buddhism. And a friend of mine suggested that I take a Vipassana meditation retreat. And so I took one with Dr. Rina Surkar, and the rest is history. I took this 9-day Vipassana retreat, and it was like coming home. And I began to practice very intensively, became a manager for many of Rina's retreats. And when she asked me one day, as I was graduating with my master's in counseling psychology, if I wanted to go to Burma with her and a group of other students to ordain under her teacher, Tongpu Lucero, a forest monk, it was definitely yes. And so in November of 1980, I flew to Burma with Rina and some other students, and I took a temporary ordination for a few months and became a monk in the forest tradition. in Burma under Tungpa Lucero, and been involved deeply with these practices within Theravada Buddhism ever since. And when Tungpa Lucero came back to the United States, I disrobed and actually helped with Rena and other students, and we helped found the Tungpa Lukabai Monastery in Boulder Creek, and I lived there for 8.5 years, serving the monks, practicing very intensively. So actually, there's more to the story as I go on here. And so after I left the monastery, I got married. I was working at a stroke center, working with people with stress, pain, and illness, with strokes, Parkinson's, MS, other neurological, orthopedic conditions, teaching them mindfulness. And a friend of mine said to me, I was telling him about this. He was an ex-monk friend. And he said, I just got this book. I'm going to send it to you. It's about some guy in Massachusetts that's working with mindfulness with people with stress, pain, and illness. And sent me this book. It was called Full Catastrophe Living. And I read it, and I was like, I couldn't believe what John Kabat-Zinn had created. I wrote him a letter to thank him so much for this book and shared with him what I was doing at the Stroke Center, because I was already teaching mindfulness with people with disabilities and getting amazing stories of it being very helpful. And then John called me back a couple of weeks later. This was before he was famous, with the Bill Moyer series, and invited me to come to Massachusetts to visit him, which I did. And at that time, he knew of my background. There was no professional trainings in MBSR teaching at the time. And essentially said, well, you have the book Full Catastrophe Living. It has the curriculum. Go and teach it. If you have any questions, give me a call. So that's kind of the long-winded story of how I came from this Dharmic background into teaching mindfulness into more of a mainstream setting. And I've been very much involved with this since 1991.
Well, thank you for that recounting and the interesting stories and the trajectory and how these different aspects of contemplative practice have interwoven into your life. And I think what I really wanted to get into is what we're seeing today is some discussions between the mindfulness movement, if we can use that term very broadly speaking, which is mainstreaming what has, I think, been rooted in the MBSR program that you mentioned, and traditional Buddhist practice, whether it's Theravada or Zen or whatever one's particular tradition may be. There seems to be a bit of a concern about what is missing. Are we only teaching a part of the Buddha Dhamma, or is the whole of the practice really encompassed in this program, in this mindfulness thing that we do? And this was something that you had discussed at the scientific conference a couple of years ago, and I was honored to attend that particular program that you gave, where you tied it together. And since that time, in my own exploration of MBSR and in the teacher training track, which is a bit more involved than John saying, you've got the book, go forth and teach. I've got to work with you and other wonderful people at the Center for Mindfulness, and have come to greatly admire and respect your commitment to the practice and how we make this available for everyone, which to me is at the heart of what we want to do. So what I'd like, Bob, for you to do, if you would, is talk a little bit about how a mindfulness program, not necessarily MBSR, but other programs as well, because you do have some experience with that, tie to what we think of as the Dharma and the Eightfold Path.
I think what I'd like to speak, because what I do most is teach insight meditation and teach MBSR. So I feel very versed in those two areas. And I know that there's other mindfulness programs. I can't speak a lot about them. I can speak broadly that I think anything that brings more awareness and heart into the world is very much needed. And perhaps these are very powerful seeds of awareness and heart that will lead one to dive deeper and deeper into the Dharma. But I can say that when I read Full Catastrophe Living so many years ago, and then was so much moved with how John had put together this program and what he was doing, there was something in me coming from a monastic background, having lived 8.5 years in a Buddhist monastery, being a former monk at one point, and deeply diving into the three baskets, the Tipitaka, and I learned Pali terms. I mean, my PhD is in philosophy, religion, specializing in Buddhist psychology, particularly in Theravada Buddhism. And so I recognized right away that there was something there in full catastrophe living, though I couldn't quite articulate it. It's taken actually years to articulate, but it was something incredibly resonant with the heart and the essence of the Dharma. And as the years have gone by, I think no matter whether you're Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, I think there's agreement within these schools of the four great noble truths. So that I actually prefer to them more as profound realizations that the Buddha realized sitting underneath the Bodhi tree. These are powerful teachings about suffering, its causes, and the pathway to greater freedom through the lessening of dukkha, the lessening of suffering, and experiencing deeper freedom. And I recognize that in MBSR that these Four Noble Truths are found within the contextual framework of the curriculum. And the first night is really the noble truth of suffering, where we go around the circle and we share about what really, really brings us here. And then bringing with the faculties of mindfulness, we investigate what's going on within the body and mind through beginning to develop the four foundations of mindfulness. We bring the mindfulness of the body with the body scan, mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness of day-to-day activities, the postures, and so forth. And of course, we're bringing awareness to the different feeling types, the Vedana, the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, getting in touch with different mind states. And of course, the challenges that come up in the practice we find in the fourth foundation of working with the hindrances, developing the factors of awakening. So these are all implicitly offered within this curriculum. As we begin to investigate suffering, we begin to investigate its causes due to habitual patterns, unawareness, grasping, aversion, stress reactivity, we could say. And of course, the difference when we become mindful and we can begin to respond in a much more constructive way, we can begin to become less enslaved by this narrative, this story. Many people talk about that, recognize that, I'm not my thoughts. And we begin to recognize that the story or the narrative that I've described about who it is that I am is a limited definition. When that comes along, I know sometimes there's some conversations about, well, where's the ethics? And I can say that within the whole 8-week curriculum, it's really the Eightfold Noble Path, how to live our lives. When people develop awareness, they begin to recognize when they're living out of integrity. When the recognition of living out of integrity is there, one begins to become more in line with integrity. So this is the development of sila. Development of sila, or virtue, helps us settle and calm the mind. We develop samadhi, concentration. With the combination of the development of sila and samadhi, panya, wisdom can begin to arise.
That's the same thing that I see about this program, is that we do have a very different situation with a finite program versus someone living their whole life going to a traditional center and having different talks every week for weeks and months and years. Really, with an MBSR program as our main example, you have a crowd of people who don't really know anything about this, and you get them once a week for a couple of hours for 8 weeks. And one of the things that I admire most about the way in which the program has been crafted is that it does provide those foundational concepts and ability to practice so that the whole of the Dhamma can unfold naturally on its own. And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I can say that, yes, 8 weeks is not long, but it's enough time to begin to grow a practice. And it's also important to say that many of the people that enroll into MBSR programs or mindfulness programs are being, they're hearing it word of mouth, or their doctors have told them, or their therapists, or their nurses, and they're coming there because they have suffering. And many of these people that are mainstream Americana would not be interested in going to IMS or Spirit Rock or some meditation center, and having it housed in a hospital is a very safe place under the domain of mind-body medicine. I also want to say that it is important that 8 weeks is really just a blip in the length of one's life. And so providing ongoing support is very important for those that go through MBSR classes. And so we at a hospital have once a week drop-in meditation groups. We have 8-day-long sessions a year that always alumni are invited back free as a way to support themselves in the practice. And of course, we give out resources of different meditation centers. We're very lucky in Northern California It's a mindfulness mecca. There's so many different meditation centers that we refer people out to, and people can begin to practice and to support themselves in the practice. So actually, I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, so maybe let me know. And
That is a terrific answer. And I was thinking if you had any thoughts about these different teaching methodologies, the different ways of planting the seed, because in a traditional program, we would have something like where a teacher will give a talk and they will take questions and they will answer them, and that's it. It's very much focused on the didactic. And in an MBSR program, there's more of this group sharing. It's a very different kind of exploration and dynamic. And can you tell a little bit about how that supports learning for the individual in this group setting?
yeah, that's very true. And I can remember for years going to the meditation center, and we never talked to anyone. The teacher leads a meditation, then leads a Dharma talk, and we ask a little bit of Q&A. Maybe on a rare occasion, it might be tea afterwards, but most of the time you don't even know who people are. There's a sense of community because we are practicing together. So there is that quality of Sangha, but the sense of the interrelational to begin to really connect with others doesn't often happen in meditation centers. It's happening more now. I think many meditation centers are realizing the importance of community and to really get to know one another. A lot of the meditators, though, are not, as a generalization goes, that fond of speaking. I think meditation draws in a lot of introverts. And, for me, who I am an introvert to some degree and a little bit shy, it's a paradise. It's heaven to go for a day long and not have to look and to talk. And so it's an edge to begin to talk and to begin to relate. And in MBSR classes, there's this beautiful combination of practicing together, learning the practice as we're practicing, talking about the practice, and talking, of course, about what brings us to the practice, which, of course, is that unifying common element that we all share, which is dukkha. I'm here because of panic and anxiety. I'm here because I have cancer. I'm here because I have chronic pain. I'm here because I'm going through a divorce. I'm here because I've dealt with drug addiction. I'm here for this, for that, overwhelmed. So there's a commonality that people begin to share about what brings them there, that connects one to another. In each class, we practice, we do sitting meditation, we also do movement. We recognize the importance of movement with hatha yoga, walking meditation. We spend time in small groups talking with one another about what we're learning about ourselves as we're doing the practice, what's challenging. And then we come back into the large group. And again, we're interacting in a whole group gestalt of what am I learning about the practice? What's difficult? Questions that are arising. So there's these elements of people working and learning and sharing what they're learning. And in time, often the class begins to teach itself. There's a wisdom that comes about through the practice itself that people begin to share.
Yeah, it's very much the world in small, because people learn from one another, and the experiences that intersect and that are very different nonetheless resonate with the core suffering that the individual is going through, and that helps us with our own learning in that it removes our isolation, because we're realizing, wait, I'm not alone in this. Everyone is suffering. It's not just me.
What I remember talking with my elder Seatos about this work. They're now all gone. They're all passed away, but they were just so thrilled that mindfulness could be here to be of help, to help alleviate any suffering. So it was really quite striking, the support that I would like. I think there's a recognition within the Siervos, they're suffering. And if there's anything that we can do to help alleviate suffering, I'm not going to say that MBSR is going to take you all the way to Nibbana. And how many people do we know that are in the Buddhist tradition that are also experiencing Nibbana? Come on. And so we're all working on understanding suffering and its causes and the pathway to its lessening, whatever vehicle it is.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a moment, because that was the next area I wanted to explore, is this concept of enlightenment. This is something we've done a number of episodes on from a secular perspective. What do we mean by that? How does that work? And Bob, as you and I have talked about before, when we use the word secular here, we don't mean in a very antiseptic clinical way. We mean it as open to everyone rather than being associated with a particular ideological stance. It's not about that. It doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of awe and inspiration. That's still there. And what you have termed in our discussions as the sacred, sure, absolutely. That's for human beings. We do gain our inspiration in these ways. But there's still this open question on, as we have enlightenment, and I like the way you have characterized what our work is in the Dhamma. There's nonetheless this, well, but mindfulness it's just one piece of an 8-piece pie, and alone that's not going to lead to enlightenment. Therefore, this isn't good. And you brought up the example that I do sometimes as well. If the path, as we have seen in the Pali Canon, leads inevitably to a full emancipation and a full freedom, shouldn't we see countries that are filled with arhants? And yet we see that's not the case. And the pushback is typically, well, the no true Scotsman fallacy. They're not really doing the Buddhist practice. Like, well, but many of our teachers or our fellow practitioners or others who really are dedicated, can we say that those are fully enlightened beings? And so let's talk a little bit. What are your thoughts a bit more on enlightenment and how that plays into just what we do, either as Buddhists or mindfulness practitioners?
So yeah, there's the classical definitions of the stream entry, the once returner, the never returner, the one that is completely eradicated greed, hatred, and ignorance, the arahant, the destroyer of the enemies. You know, those classifications, of course, are in Theravada, and then we get into Zen, there's Satori. So there's different definitions as we begin to cross the different thresholds of the Dharma, depending on which camp you're in, whether it's Vajrayana, Mahayana. And of course, within Mahayana, there's so many different variations, from Zen to Chinese Zen and Japanese Zen, and different traditions within the Mahayana tradition. So the word enlightenment gets, which context are we speaking from, for one. But number two, I remember Stephen Levine once saying, maybe it's not about enlightenment, but it's about getting lighter. And in moments that we recognize that we are caught and we see the caughtness and can become free of getting caught, these are moments where there's more space and more freedom. And the notion of enlightenment is a very interesting notion, because often for many of us here in the West and probably in the East, it's always sometimes it's going to happen later. If not this lifetime, then maybe next lifetime, and maybe 100,000 lifetimes ahead. But it's something that's always going to be later. And actually, my wonderful, beloved teacher, Tumpu Luceto, in some ways, he indirectly kind of challenged that. And actually, it's really encapsulated in a very beautiful, very short meditation that he taught with us. He actually spent a whole rainy season emphasizing this one particular practice, that he said this would be a very good practice for the dying. But I also think it's a very good practice for us to know that the taste of freedom is right here. And so if I could be daring enough, humbling enough, I'd love to just maybe do a little practice with this right now.
Please do, yes.
So just sitting wherever you are, whoever's listening to this, and just taking a moment to just feel settled in the chair or wherever you're sitting, or standing or lying, and becoming mindful of the breath in and mindful of the breath out. And as you breathe in and breathe out, in these few breaths, just feel what it's like, that in these few breaths that you are absolutely content with the way things completely are. So there's no sense of wanting or wishing for anything to be different. That there's no greed or grasping or craving arising in the moment, in these few breaths, and that you can just experience a sense of contentment and ease without any grasping for anything different. Just breathing in and out and allowing yourself to just be open to experiencing the sense of contentment, free of wanting. And then gently within the next few breaths, experiencing the sense of generosity, heartfulness, that being free of aversion or hatred, anger. In these few moments, sense of just some generosity of heart, some lightness, some ease, some sense of loving kindness, compassion as you breathe in and breathe out. And now gently bringing awareness to the breath again and again, accompanying with awareness this clarity of mind. There's the knowing of the breathing in as you're breathing in, the knowing of the breath as you're breathing out. There's no ignorance here. There's no unawareness. There's the clarity of knowing of the breath in and the breath out, feeling the clarity. And so it is said that the Arahant, the destroyer of the enemies in Pali, destroyer of what enemies of greed, hatred, and ignorance, that with these breaths, the breathing in and out, free of want, feeling of contentment, the breathing in and out, without aversion, without anger, without hatred, the feelings of a heart of loving kindness, and the breathing in and breathing out, no ignorance, no unawareness, the clarity of the knowing, the breath in and out, that these are the states of the heart of one who's free. And that we can experience that briefly in these moments. Of course, the Arahant perhaps has a more of a sustained capability of the sense of the generosity, the heartfulness, the contentfulness, the clarity of the heart, which can be available to all of us. So I'd like to just say, so may all beings be free. And one thing that I would like to just maybe, I don't know if we're getting towards our closing, but I'd like to invite all of our Dharma friends and so forth. There is indeed, as you said earlier, Ted, that there's a lot of discussion about, well, mindfulness is only one of the steps and so forth. And so, yes, a lot of us as Buddhist scholars, we are entitled completely to our point of views. If we look at the text in these famous sutta of the Kalama Sutta, where the Buddha speaks about, don't believe the teacher because the teacher says so. Don't believe the teachings because the teachings say so. See for yourself with your own experience. Ehi pasiko. See for yourself with your own experience. But one thing that's important for us all to know, the students of Dharma, that there's more to this sutta than the Kalama Sutta. And actually within the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha offers us criterion to determine whether something is helpful, is beneficial or not. And I would love to appeal to all of us with strong opinions here and there on which side of the fence you sit with mindfulness. But as we look at mindfulness programs in general, let's bring them up to the Kalama Sutta and use the Buddha's criterion for what is beneficial or not. And of course, within that sutta, the Buddha speaks about, and he goes through greed, hatred, and ignorance, that if because the Kalamas, they were asking the Buddha, so many teachers come through, and how do we know what is good and what is not good? So again, the Buddha says, don't believe the teachers because the teachers say so and so forth. But then he leaves this criteria. If what is spoken, does it help grow in greed or lessen greed? Does it grow in hatred or does it lessen hatred? Does it grow in more delusion, ignorance, and unawareness, or does it lessen it? See for yourself if this path is growing towards lessening greed, hatred, and ignorance. We can say with knowing and knowledge that this is a good path. Conversely, if it's growing more greed, more hatred, and more ignorance, we can say that this perhaps is not the beneficial paths. And so it's very interesting, right within that sutta, within the kalamas. And I invite all of us scholars to review this and to look deeply into this as criterion for evaluating what is beneficial. And I think if we all read this, we might discover that, maybe some of these mindfulness secular approaches, though it's not in the classic Dharmic tradition ways, is it lessening or is it growing greed, hatred, and ignorance? Let us use the Buddha's teachings to inquire on this.
It's a wonderful point, Bob. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of our favorite suttas, and the phrase ehipassiko is one we've used many times on this podcast. And you bring up a very good point that although the Kalama Sutta is well known as, perhaps in some circles, best known and only known, unfortunately, as the Buddha's sutta about critical thinking, we also tend to lose the aspect of it that it does provide that criterion for evaluation that isn't based on an ideological stance, but based on what we see in the world about greed, hatred, and delusion.
A friend of mine, actually, she's the founder of the Buddhist Insight Network, Kim Allen, and she's a friend of mine, and we were talking about this, and so we had actually been recently studying the Kalama Sutta together in a class, and then she offered to me, she said, let's leave it to the Kalama Sutta, let's leave it to the criterion to determine whether things are beneficial or not through the teachings in the Dharma. And I thought that was just brilliant. So I can't say that I invented, that was my original idea, but that was a deep chord of resonance within me. Let us use the criterion that the Buddha talked about as a way to determine what is beneficial or not. Or at least to be open to that. And yes, we have our own opinions and they're valid too, but let us also look at this criterion, which I think is incredibly valuable since we hold that the teachings in the Dharma are very important and we're students of the Dharma, of the Buddhist teaching.
Well, thank you very much. Our guest today has been Bob Stahl, and there are a couple of sites that I'm going to link on the episode page for this episode. One is mindfulnessprograms.com and also mbsrworkbook.com. Bob, beloved teacher, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Ted. And actually, there's one more website for those of you that are into the 32 parts of the body meditation, which I'm a great practitioner and fan of. There's the number 32, PARTS.com. Take a look at that. You will be amazed with the history inside our bodies.
32parts.com, and I'll be linking that as well. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you too, Ted. Blessings to you all.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.